listening to the Takeback Podcast, where women of color creatives come together to inspire, empower, and encourage each other.
I'm Jess Pillay, an Indo-Fijian independent singer-songwriter.
And I'm Angelica and Jess, a Mexican-American licensed mental health counselor and singer. And this is the podcast where we explore and elevate stories from women of color who are artists, musicians, actors, entrepreneurs, and so on, who are navigating and taking back systems designed against them.
Welcome back to the Takeback Podcast. I'm Jess Pillay, and I'm here with my co-host, Angelica and Jess. And this week, we have a very special additional co-host with us, Sam Cook-Stuntz. Welcome, Sam.
Hello.
So good to have you. So for those of you who are stumbling upon this podcast episode for whatever reason, Sam is usually the guy who's behind the scenes, so you don't usually hear him. And for those of you who have been listening for the last 13 episodes, you've probably heard us reference Sam before. He's our amazing sound engineer and audio engineer, and the guy who kind of runs everything behind the scenes to make sure that this show sounds its best. But today, we wanted to bring him into the limelight for this very special season finale episode 14. But before we get into the meat of the conversation, Angelica and I wanted to take a moment and make a very important and bittersweet announcement. If you've been following us on Instagram, you've probably already seen this because we just made an announcement about it there. But today is not only our season finale, but also our final episode. That's right. This is the last episode of the Takeback Podcast. We won't bore you listeners with the nitty-gritty details of why we made this decision. We may talk about it a little bit more on social media and our email list if you're on that. But essentially what it all boils down to is it is a lot of work to produce a high-quality podcast. And this year has come with some unexpected challenges for the two of us and kind of just realizing that we don't really have the bandwidth to do this at this point. And, you know, we're both doing a lot of other work and things outside of this. This is not our full-time profession. And so it's time to let it go. But yeah, what would you like to add?
You know, it's sometimes making a decision like this is not easy, but it's something that I'm feeling calm and at peace about. And kind of like what Jess said is, you know, we wanted to come into this project putting our best effort forward because we wanted to do justice to the stories that we tell on this podcast. Mm-hmm. But just like she said, with everything that we juggle in our lives, we just didn't have the bandwidth. And at no point did we want to let the quality of our podcast take a hit. So like I said, these decisions are not easy, but I am so incredibly thankful to have this experience. This was a dream of mine to be a podcaster. And now I can say,
I did
it. And what better way to do it with my best friend?
Yeah.
So I just want to take a minute to say thank you. I am so incredibly humbled for all the people that have supported us throughout this journey. Every single listener, every single guest that gave us the honor to allow Jess and I to interview them.
Honor. Yeah.
Very much so. Our wonderful team that supported us.
Our team. I'm going to miss our team the most.
Me too.
Honestly.
I mean, we're lucky that they're local, but I am so incredibly thankful for them because without them, I think that we would have probably lost some more hairs from our head. And of course, I don't want to forget our friends and our family members who have been cheering us along from the sidelines from day one, from the birth of this concept of our podcast. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being a part of this journey with us. We also want to share some final thoughts towards the end of the episode, as well as on our social media about our decision. But for now, we want to spend the next few minutes chatting with our dear friend Sam.
Yay!
Something that's so incredibly vital in the work of racial equity, or really any type of work revolving around systemic change, is having some reliable allies. People from what's considered the privileged group or groups who who are willing to partner with those who are typically considered marginalized to break down those systems of injustice that exist. We've been very intentional about centering the stories of women of color creatives here on this podcast. But for today, we wanted to take some time to talk with you, Sam, about your experience listening to and editing these conversations and how this impacts your life and the work that you do as a member of the creator economy.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
We're so glad you're here. It's fun to actually hear your voice on this. I mean, I hear your voice all the time just because we talk a lot, but to have you in this context.
But I'm usually saying things like, hey, can you say that again so I can make sure the compressor's at the right level?
Exactly. Okay, so let's talk about your work for a second. You are a music producer and a musician, and for anybody who doesn't know this, also a white man. I'm just confirming that.
I am.
You're also college educated. You're a homeowner. You have all these great things going for you. And you're somebody that, you know, this system that we've spent 13 episodes talking about, you would be, I would argue, somebody that the system benefits. Would you concur with that?
Definitely.
Yeah. And yet I remember even when this idea first came to be and I pitched it to you and said, I think I'm going to start this podcast. I have this idea. And, you know, we had a conversation about this whole idea of the system and how it often doesn't support and value women of color specifically. You could have done the thing that a lot of white folks do, which is gaslight and be like, yeah, I don't believe that, or I don't want to have anything to do with that. And yet instead, you jumped right in and you said, I love this idea. I think you should do it. I'm even willing to support you and help you bring it to life. So my question is, why is that? Why did you decide that you wanted to be involved with the Takeback podcast?
I mean, first of all, I just enjoy working with both of you. So, you know, whatever you had wanted to do a podcast about, I would have been happy to help. If you'd wanted to do a podcast about orcas, which in Jess's case would be very, very plausible, I would have been happy to do sound for that one as well. But yeah, in terms of, I mean, this podcast specifically, you know, like you said, I'm a musician and a music producer, and I've been lucky enough to have collaborated with, you know, a number of really, really talented musicians who are also women of color. And so, you know, some of the things that you were bringing up as the reasons for wanting to start this podcast, just conversations around the ways that the system treats women of color differently and challenges they face in becoming professional or hobby artists that maybe white people don't face as often. I've heard some of my clients talk about those same things. And so, you know, in terms of, you know, why didn't I respond by gaslighting or denying that it was true? It's like I've already heard so many people confirm the things that you're talking about that, you know, it's not difficult for me to believe that they're real because I have not experienced them personally as a white person, but I've heard friends of mine and people I love and care about talk about them all the time. And so it's clear that those issues are important, that they're hurting a lot of people. And I mean, I thought it was valid when you guys were both talking about how you did a fair amount of research into other podcasts that existed and found that, you know, there weren't too many other people having this specific conversation. And, you know, the fact that it's an important conversation that affects a lot of people, coupled with the fact that not as many other people were having it, meant that it was clear that this was a really important project that you wanted to undertake. And so if there was some even little way I could help bring it to life, I was happy to.
Little way. It was way more than little. You did so much for us. You've done so much for us. And so, you know, thank you. We wouldn't be here. We wouldn't have made it this far without you.
No, we really wouldn't.
So.
I mean, we are literally right now in his studio recording this episode.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, that's cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Well, Sam, you touched on this about hearing stories from working with creatives who are also people of color, but also hearing from me and Jess and some other friends of yours that are people of color, just their stories of just the different ways that they've encountered a lot of oppressive systems. And as you know, for us women of color, and honestly, just people of color, we often face involuntary silence. I know for myself and Jess, we've often talked about how we are constantly being told that we shouldn't take up so much space or that we should follow a certain set of rules in terms of how we communicate, how we express ourselves, or to be a little bit more palatable to our white counterparts. So what was it like for you to have to sit in silence and to be in listening mode for 13 episodes
Yeah. I mean, first of all, for anyone who knows me, I'm a chatterbox, so it's not always easy to get me to shut up. But being able to be involved in this project from a listening standpoint, as the person sometimes physically in the other room with headphones on, just listening to the conversation happen, not being the one participating, it's been interesting because just the breadth of life experiences that were discussed on the podcast. I mean, obviously, like you said, I'm a musician, and a number of the guests you've interviewed are also musicians. And so those conversations, just on kind of a nerdy level, it was hard for me to not want to speak up and just kind of, jump in and, geek out with these people over interests that we have in common.
Right.
And then, there are other people who are in lines of work that are much less familiar to me. Like you've obviously, had people who are authors, who've written books, novels, people who are content creators, YouTubers, visual artists, which are all arenas that I'm less familiar with. And so with those conversations, especially, it was fascinating just to sit back and hear people talk about a corner of the world that I'm not familiar with and, and industries that I'm not familiar with. So, yeah, I think it was sort of a more purposeful exercise, reminding myself to sit back and not speak up when you were talking to people who were talking about things that I'm familiar with, because, a lot of white people's predisposition is to jump in and center a conversation around themselves when the conversation involves something that they consider themselves to be authorities on. And it's not even that I consider myself to be an authority on music. It's just whenever people are talking about music, I probably have thoughts and I probably have stories I want to share. And so it was kind of a useful exercise to have that impulse to want to insert myself in the conversation and to remember, like, no, this isn't a forum where the conversation is meant to be centered around me. In fact, it's specifically designed to be a forum to be centered around people other than me. That was interesting, and I think just a useful thing for me that, or I guess I would say it's a tendency that I don't always practice. And so it was useful to have kind of, a built-in opportunity to remind myself, like, nope, this is a good time to just sit back and let other people talk and learn from them.
And what's so interesting to hear you say that is our life experience. That is how we live.
Right.
We always go into every single situation having to ask ourselves, should I open my mouth?
Right.
Right.
Well, and not only that, but constantly going to situations and sitting in discomfort. And that's just our normal life experience, our day to day. And Sam, I just love that you acknowledge, as a white man, just often being able to speak up and to say things and centering conversations around your thoughts and ideas, and to be in a position where in this creative project, you had that kind of omitted and taken away, and you had to sit and listen to really difficult stories.
Sure.
And can I just tell you, Sam, that you did it with such grace. And even afterwards, when we would debrief each of the episodes, like just your insights and comments that you made to me and Jess was just really very thoughtful. And I'm glad that I can consider you a friend and an ally.
Yeah. And one thing you said, I remember early on when we were maybe doing our first episode even and recording right here in the studio, you asked me the question, if at any point you need me to step out because the conversations are so personal, let me know. And that stuck with me because nobody ever asked that question.
No, they don't.
And I almost didn't know how to respond when you even said that, because I was like, that's a choice. Like, I get to make that decision. What, But yeah, I think it's so interesting to hear you talk about having that forced silence and what that did to your sort of thought patterns and having to decide, oh, I think I have something to say, but I know it's not my place to say something. Like I said, that's literally our day-to-day existence. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a work meeting or in church or, other contexts that I've been in where I'm like, ooh, I really want to say something about the racial lens that is being represented or not represented here.
Right.
But I know if I do, it's going to open up some stuff that people in this room are not ready to hear.
Right.
So it's just fascinating to hear you now, as somebody who is privileged, having to make that assessment.
Yeah.
Like you've now stepped into our shoes a little bit in that sense.
Yeah.
In admittedly a very, very small and very, kind of artificially imposed way.
Sure.
And that's obviously the biggest difference, is that in the case of the podcast, this was all a 100% like mutually voluntary arrangement.
Sure.
Where, I was stepping into it knowing that the concept was that this is a show that's going to be centered around the voices of women of color, and that I'm working on it in a technical capacity, and I'm not here to, have my voice elevated and centered. And the situations you're describing, I get the sense that's not usually a voluntary arrangement. You're not usually walking into those situations thinking like, oh, I'm willingly going into this work meeting knowing that my voice is not meant to be the focus. It's just that's something that's imposed on you. And so I guess that's something I've been conscious of, even doing the podcast, is that this is just a very, very tiny microcosm of that situation for a lot of other people.
Yeah.
Well, Sam, I'm really curious to hear a little bit more about how the stories that we shared, how they inspired or challenged you on your own outlook or perspective.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like I was saying earlier, I think just by virtue of the fact that I'm in a very specific line of work, that I do, music and audio production and things like that, I think it's sometimes easier to have an entry point into an issue if the person you're hearing from has something in common with you, whether it's they work in your line of work or they share an interest. So I think some of the perspectives that I found most initially helpful as entry points were the people you were speaking to who do similar work to me. So the conversation you did with Sherry Lynn was especially, I think, really interesting because she obviously does a lot of the same things I do. Like, she's a phenomenal music producer, musician, multi-instrumentalist, songwriter. She is kind of in the same corner of the arts that I am. And so some of the stories that she was sharing, and I had a couple conversations with her even after the episode about this, but some of the stories she was sharing involved situations that I could routinely find myself in, which is conversations she's had with white male producers when she's been in the studio for a recording project, possibly where she was the only non-white person in the studio. And just talking about passive aggressive or kind of unintentionally bigoted comments that someone would make that maybe the white person in question didn't even realize that they were saying something insensitive. And, maybe they wouldn't remember the exchange 5 minutes later, but it stuck with her enough that, she was able to recall it easily on the podcast years later.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think especially hearing stories about closed-minded behavior that have taken place in the types of rooms that I routinely find myself in, I think were like challenging and thought-provoking for me because, I just found myself thinking, okay, the conversations that she's describing are conversations that I could be having with clients. And so it kind of made me stop and think about, okay, are any of these things that she's describing things that I have maybe unintentionally said to someone, not realizing that I was saying something insensitive, or are any of the assumptions that she says that people have made about her, are those assumptions that I find myself unknowingly or unintentionally making about clients of mine who aren't white or, who aren't men? And then taking that and trying to put myself in the shoes of other guests of yours who, like I said, work in industries that I'm less familiar with, but it's easy for me to imagine, okay, I'm not an author, but it's easy for me to imagine the same conversation happening between, a woman of color who's an author and a publisher who's a white man, and just thinking, okay, well, if I were in that man's position, what could I easily find myself saying that would be hurtful to someone in this other person's position?
Which is so important because what you're describing really is allyship, and it's active allyship, because I think a lot of people take that word that's kind of become a buzzword in the racial justice, racial equity space, where it's like, I think any white person out there, nobody wants to think of themselves as racist. Nobody wants to think of themselves as someone who isn't truly an ally to their BIPOC counterparts. And one thing I've really noticed and realized is it takes work, and it takes that intentional self-reflection. And so I really appreciate, Sam, that you've been willing to do that self-reflection. And I've seen this in other contexts too, not just in the context of this podcast, but I think it's one of the reasons that you and I are such close friends is because not only do we work really well together in a professional capacity when it comes to doing music and doing the podcast, but I can have hard, real conversations with you where I share stuff I've experienced as a woman of color. And your response to that is to say, what's my role in this? You ask those questions. So many people are just like, oh, I'm sorry that happened to you.
Right.
And then don't want to do anything beyond that.
Yeah.
They think that that's enough. And it's not enough. That's not what allyship really is, right? Allyship is coming alongside and being actively involved in tearing down the system.
Well, it's taking that privilege that you walk into spaces not realizing that you have and taking a minute to acknowledge, oh, wait, I do have it. And what do I do about it?
Right. Which is where a lot of people get stuck.
Yeah.
Unfortunately.
They do.
So we've spent the whole podcast talking to women of color and about women of color and the things that we are doing collectively to take back the system. And there's a flip side to that, right? As our allies, white folks have to be willing to do work to tear down the system that they've created and benefited from. So Sam, some questions for you. What are you doing to develop your knowledge when it comes to being an ally? Like, what does that mean to you? What are some steps that you've been taking in your life to say, I'm going to do that self-reflection and actually become an active participant in tearing down these systems?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the most profound things I've heard someone say about the idea of allyship, I forget where I first heard this exchange, but it was, I think, a conversation between a white person and a person of color. And the white person kept referring to themselves as an ally, kept affirmatively saying, well, I'm an ally, as an ally, speaking as an ally. And at one point, the other person kind of gently told them something like, as a white person, you don't get to self-designate as an ally. Like, you don't get to decide whether or not you're an ally. The people who you are working to help are the ones who get to decide whether you're an ally. And so they're basically like, that's the notion that, that's not a title that someone can just decide to give themselves.
Right.
It's a label or a designator that's earned. And so I think one thing I've tried to do, it's maybe a minor semantic thing, but one thing I've tried to do is not to call myself an ally, but just to say, I want to be an ally, or I am trying to be an ally, because it's not ultimately up to me whether or not I am. It's up to the people that I am purportedly trying to, work to help, and the causes that I'm hopefully working to bring attention to. It's up to those people to decide whether I'm actually doing that in an appropriate and substantive way. Yeah, I think to any white people who like to call themselves allies, I think that's an important and humbling thing to remember.
Well, I can tell you this. You are an ally. I can confirm that. For sure. You definitely have been, and you are. And I really appreciate that very humble kind of posture that you have in that. And then kind of speaking more in terms of the creative work that you do as a musician and a producer, and as someone who collaborates pretty frequently with women of color, myself included, when it comes to music projects and the work that you do professionally. Do you have any practical advice for other white or other, privileged members of the creative sector on things that they can do to create more equity in their business practices and just in their interactions with BIPOC creators?
Yeah, I mean, as far as interactions with BIPOC creators, I'm again going to refer to something Sherry Lynn said, because again, I've actually had a couple conversations with her even following the episode about this. But one thing, when I was kind of asking, her for advice, as someone who has both been a producer and a client of producers, I was asking her, what are some things that people in my position need to kind of be aware of and check themselves on? And I think one just very practical bit of advice she said was just don't make assumptions about people, because she said, women of color, especially in the studio, are so used to having their skills or their knowledge second guessed, and they're so used to producers and collaborators assuming that they know less about the thing in question than the white person does. Yeah. So, she was saying, even if you're working with someone and you don't think they know anything about production or the technical process of recording, microphones, preamps, compressors, all that stuff, she said, just don't assume that the person you're working with is ignorant. Don't start explaining something to them in a way that makes it clear that you're assuming they don't know anything about it.
Don't mansplain.
Exactly. Yeah.
Or industry splain in this case.
And she said, that's not to say that all women of color artists, are knowledgeable about every area of the process, but it is to say that a lot of them are, but are used to being treated like they're not.
Yeah.
And so she was saying, even just start by asking questions, before launching into an explanation of something, just ask the person you're working with, hey, are you involved in the technical side of music at all? What's your experience with, recording equipment, things like that? And if they make it clear, oh, that's not really my area of expertise, could you explain it a little to me? Then you can go into it. But if it becomes clear that the person's like, oh yeah, I have a home studio and I've been recording and mixing music for 10 years, then you don't need to explain something to them like they don't understand it, because they may very well understand it a lot better than you do.
Yeah.
Things like that. I think she also said just, trying to read the room, if you're, if you as a white person are launching into an impassioned rant about, something that's maybe very important to you, or you're spending 10 minutes talking about this new really amazing piece of recording equipment that you got, and you can kind of see that the person you're working with just isn't really feeling the conversation, or you're not really in territory that is, as interesting to them, sort of see if you can shift the conversation to something that they are just as passionate about as you. So maybe a client I'm working with doesn't care about different microphones, but is really, really excited about different kinds of instruments, because they're a multi-instrumentalist, and that's kind of where their character and their personality shines. Once you figure that out, try to center the conversation around that. And I feel like One thing I've noticed on this podcast is you can see something happen when someone gets asked about something that they don't normally get a chance to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
There's just like, you can even hear it even though you can't see them. You can almost hear them like lighting up and kind of them being infused with this new kind of energy. Like, oh, you know, I get to talk about this thing that I spend all this time thinking about. Like that's really exciting. And I think in terms of practical advice, kind of on the business end, another thing I think about a lot is I'm in a very privileged position in a lot of ways. One way that I think even more privileged than a lot of people is, so I'm very fortunate to have a spouse who is our household's full-time breadwinner. So my wife is an economist. She has a PhD in economics. She's way smarter than I am. I'm okay
She's a
admitting
badass,
that.
in other words.
Yeah. And so I'm unbelievably fortunate that she has a job that's stable enough to support both of us. And so the music work that I do is not work that we're relying on to pay mortgage or to pay bills or anything. So I'm in an unusually flexible position where my income from the music work that I do isn't the difference between us, you know, paying our bills or not paying our bills, or us being able to get groceries. And so I think one implication of that is no matter who you're working with, if you're working with someone who is disadvantaged in some way, whether it's like socially disadvantaged or financially disadvantaged. I work with a lot of students who understandably don't have a ton of disposable income and don't usually have thousands of dollars to blow on music projects that may or may not recoup their costs. If you're working with people who you can maybe tell have some disadvantage within the industry or just within society in general, and there's some small way that you can make the process more accessible to them, especially if you're in a lucky enough position that doing that will not affect your livelihood at all, then it's good to go out of your way to try to make opportunities accessible to more people. So if you're a producer and you're approached by a client who you can tell is really passionate about music, this is, you know, something they love doing, they really, really want to get their music out into the world, but maybe they don't have an extremely well-paying job, or they don't have an extremely flexible time arrangement. They can't afford to like take a week off and spend a solid week working. You know, just maybe try to find ways to be flexible to accommodate them, especially if you're in a position where, you know, knocking $200 off of the cost of their recording project won't be the difference between you being able to pay rent or not, but it might be the difference between them being able to make this music or not make it.
Right.
Totally.
And so I would say to anyone who's fortunate enough to be in a position where they have that kind of flexibility, it's good to acknowledge that, and it's good to find ways to, I would say, extend that privilege to people who might not have it. If you can be even just one link in the chain that makes it a little easier for their work to get done and to get out into the world, then maybe go out of your way more than you normally would to make that happen.
I love that.
Round of applause for Sam. Yay. No, I love that advice so much, because the number one advice that I've been given by white men when it comes to financing my own music projects is don't let money be an obstacle. Okay, what does that mean?
Right.
Like, what are you doing to help make money not be an obstacle, right? And you just address that so beautifully. So thank you for sharing that very practical advice. I feel like we need to make this little bit a sound bite so that it can get onto social media and everywhere else, because this is a conversation that most people are not having. And I think it's so important, because I cannot tell you how many times the whole, well, if you really care about it, if you're really passionate about it, money's not going to be an issue. You'll find the money to do it. And I'm like, do you know how to do math? Because I only make so much and have these bills to pay. So,
and we live in one of the most expensive places in the nation.
Exactly.
Like, let's be real.
Yeah. You want to just be like, yeah, I'm passionate about music. You know what else I'm passionate about? Not being homeless and being able to eat this week.
Exactly.
Like, I'm also passionate about not going broke if I get sick.
Right.
Like,
yeah. Exactly.
There are a million other things I have to consider besides just the cost of this music project.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you, Sam, for doing the work and putting that in place and taking those steps to tear down the system. As women of color, it's our job to take it back. And as white privileged folks, it's your jobs to tear it down.
Tear it down and then elevate.
Yes.
So
absolutely.
Thank you, Sam. I really appreciate that little nugget, that little
It's so
gem.
practical.
I mean, it really is.
And so needed.
Thank you both. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Anything else you want to add or say to our listeners or to our team or to anybody who might be listening to this episode?
I mean, to the team, just, you already covered it earlier. Everybody who's worked on this podcast is amazing. And I want to, affirm for anyone listening who has never worked on a podcast and doesn't know how much work goes in behind the scenes. I mean, the amount of effort that Jess and Angelica and also Steph and Daniel also, put in behind the scenes. They're, you haven't even heard their voices on the podcast, but they've both worked an insane number of hours, getting content ready for social media, reviewing episodes, helping edit the episodes, helping work out organizational plans for us to do things behind the scenes. Just a lot of hours every week go into doing a podcast like this, and everybody involved in it was doing it because they believed in the topic and they believed in the messages and in getting the voices of these guests that we've had out there. So I would just say, it's been a privilege to work with everyone who's worked on this, and it's been eye-opening for me. It's, I think, an experience that I had never had. I had never worked on a podcast before doing this, and so that's been both educational and really, really enjoyable.
Yeah, I mean, none of us had. We all learned together.
Learned on the fly.
Learning on the spot is exciting.
Yeah.
But truly nobody better to do it with than the folks on our team.
I 100% agree.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sam, for letting us get your voice on a microphone for once and sharing your perspective. I think it's an important one, and I hope it's really valuable to our listeners. Okay, so one of the things that we wanted to do is spend a little bit of time, Angelica, you and I, just reflecting on this experience.
Yeah.
So one of my questions is, what surprised you the most about this experience? Sam did talk about how it's a lot of work. That was, I think, one of our biggest surprises when we got really into this, because in the beginning we're like, we got this, we could do a podcast.
Yeah.
We were even talking about like once a week episodes, and then it was like, oh no, that ain't happening.
Well, I think that's the one thing that really stood out was just, oh my goodness, people do not realize the amount of work that goes into doing a podcast.
A good podcast.
Well, right. And I would say this, I don't want to toot our, collective horn here, but I really do think that we produce such a high quality podcast. And in order to do that, it does take, the ins and the outs of just what is entailed. Like, it's mind-boggling. It's mind-boggling. I still feel like I'm still learning, even now, just hearing the bits and pieces of just what each of our members of our team has done. And we're like at the end of
the end.
I know, which I was just like, how is this possible? But with all that, is the flip side of when you put so much of your heart, your time, your money, your energy into producing such a high quality product, is sometimes, if you're not really careful, it could lead into burnout. And I think that's something that in our last episode, Izzy talked about this. But
the timing of this is actually really funny, because as I was listening to that, I was like kind of feeling called out to some extent.
But it's so true.
Yeah.
And what's so incredibly important was to have balance. And I think that was one of the things that I was not anticipating that was going to be a takeaway for our experience, is like, shit. Like, I was like, there's that old friend, hello, darkness, my old friend.
Don't sing that, because we don't have the rights to that.
Shoot. But yes, here comes burnout, our old friend, which is so ironic, right? Because we've both experienced burnout in different ways in our life. And it's just like,
we sat here on these very microphones and talked to guests about what are they doing to not burn out. And then I burned myself
and then here we are
out.
burning ourselves out. Burning our candle at both ends.
Yeah.
So that was really surprising. And that's, honestly, at the end of the day, I don't want to do things like that. I didn't want myself to do things that was going to leave us depleted. And
I'll tell you why I think we did burn out. It's the idea of the emotional weight of it all. If we were a podcast where we just sat here every week and we analyzed Rachel Yamagata's music, for example, which would be a really cool podcast, by the way.
Maybe
that's our next one.
That's our next one. Here we are ending a podcast and talking about doing another one.
Right.
I digress. Anyways.
But, if we were doing something like that, where it was just a little bit more fun and light, I think that the burnout might not have come as early.
Right.
I think because we're holding and carrying, you deal with this daily as a therapist.
I do. But
carrying the weight of these heavy, heavy, heavy stories And then having to, like, in my case, at least, you know, editing them back, like listen to this stuff over and over and over again and process it, and sometimes even be triggered by it as people are talking about their own experiences with racial injustice and bigotry and sexism and, you know, whatever else. It was a lot. And so I kind of realized I'm really passionate about this work, but it goes back to what we've talked about so many times. Women of color, the people who are, you know, who are on the receiving end of that marginalization, cannot always be the only ones trying to push the needle forward. It really takes that allyship, like we talked about earlier, and the people who constructed these systems that have to work with us and even take the lead in a lot of cases to tear these systems down. And so I think for me, it was like the burnout really was almost more of a response to the kind of emotional burden that we carried.
And it is, you know, it's interesting that you bring up the comparison of like, well, maybe this feels a little bit different for you because of what I do professionally. In fact, just earlier this week, I had a client ask me like, how do you every day for hours like hear all these stories? I mean, here I am like sharing my story with you. You know, I think with my work, because I've been doing it for so long, I'm able to compartmentalize it a little bit different. But, you know, with the Takeback, it was just so much more personal because we were interviewing people that we know, some friends. You know, I got to interview you, you got to interview me, and we just got real. Like real, not to say that people don't get real in therapy, because, you know, that's the place to get real. But there was just something so incredibly different about it because I was myself. You know, I didn't have to wear the therapist hat. I just wore no hats, right? I was just, I came in this project just being myself, being real, being authentic. And with that, when you come in to something like this, just being fully honest, raw, it does come with like, it's a rubber band effect. And so it is something so incredibly important. And I would hope that this podcast inspires you listeners to find the balance of caring for yourselves.
I think the other thing that we noticed was the commonalities in the stories, right? So we talked to people from different locations, different ethnicities, different life experiences, different creative crafts, all these different things. And yet there were so many common threads that we found in each of those stories, right? Across all these different spectrums, which I thought was
eye-opening.
It was eye-opening, and it helped me feel less alone. Yeah. I think.
And that was the whole goal of this podcast was oftentimes as women of color creatives, we feel alone, right? We know logically that we're not alone, but sometimes when we're in it and doing the work, unless we have a really solid community around us, it can feel isolating and lonely sometimes. And so being able to listen to other amazing women of color creatives to kind of just share the highs and the lows of the work that they do, you know, I got to see a little bit of myself in them. And it was kind of it was really cool. It was really, really cool just knowing that, wow, we're really not alone, that there is a lot of commonalities between us and that we can continue to cheer each other on.
Definitely. Yeah. And I think one thing that came out of this is like we now have a network of women of color all over the country.
I know.
They're from all over the place, East Coast, West Coast, in between, that we can tap into and talk shop with when it comes to creative stuff and, you know, talk about how to deal with writer's block or production or content creation for YouTube or, you know, whatever, like all these things. It's like this little collective that we formed.
I love it.
Cool. Yeah. Okay, so another question that we asked our guests on nearly every episode in the final 5 and 5 was a question that we had not quite yet developed when we initially did our episodes where we interviewed each other and played that game. But it was favorite women of color owned businesses or brands that we each recommend. So I wanted to make sure before we closed out that you and I both had an opportunity to share some of our faves. So do you want to talk about yours first?
Yeah. So I am a sucker for a good candle. I mean, maybe call me a basic bitch, but I love a good candle. So
what's the Gen Z word is like chuggy, right?
We're very chuggy. But
I do love a good candle.
I love a good candle. And, you know, there's something amazing with scent that with scent, it can do a lot of things to regulate our nervous system because, you know,
Okay, mental health
I know,
moment.
I know, have to plug it in. But yes, scent, taps into our sensory experience of smell. So I love a good candle, especially when I have a great smelling candle that can either calm me down or bring up some happy memories or just some nostalgic memories. So I've got 2 candle companies that I want to recommend. One for our Seattle-based folks, our Seattle listeners. There is a candle company by the name of Noir Luxe Candle Company, which is based in the Queen Anne neighborhood. What's really cool about this candle company is that it is a Black-owned women business, and they have pre-made small batch candles that they sell at their brick and mortar shop. They also do events at their shop as well.
Cool.
Which is really neat. So I would say check out their page. One thing that stood out to me about this company is that they encourage customers, if they want to walk through the process of making your own candle. So you get to go and see the process of what they do to make the candle, and then you make your own scents, which I'm like, that's so cool. So I'm a sucker for things like that, especially, that's a creative aspect, right?
So we should go do that together.
I think we should.
At some point.
Yes.
That'd be really fun.
So check them out. And for folks that maybe aren't local, you can order candles from their website, and then they can ship that out to you. Then, of course, I always have to do a Latina-based company plug. So in this theme of candles, there's another really, really popular up-and-coming candle company that has blown up on TikTok by the name of Luz en Tierra. This is a candle company that's based out of Texas that was initially started by this woman who was wanting to do more sustainable practice in candle making, and she took some old cups and Mexican vessels that she started to pour candle wax in.
That's really cool.
And she made 10 candles initially, and she posted it on TikTok, and she immediately sold those out and then was getting flooded with demand. So now she's got this company that's going on. It's really cool. So it's made in the U.S. by Latinas, and they purchase different vessels like cups and different little pots in Mexico to kind of support this business. So I would say go ahead and check out their website. I'm looking at it right now. And of course, I'm like, every candle sold out, sold out, sold out, sold out. So I was like, this is a very popular company. And what's cool is they make scents that are very nostalgic to the Latino community. So
that's so cool.
I know.
I know.
That. So yep, go ahead, check out these awesome women of color owned candle companies, and maybe you'll find a little scent that kind of warms your heart and soothes your mind.
Love it. Okay, so mine, I have a couple. So I grew up in Shoreline, which used to be part of North Seattle, but then became its own little city. But there's this lovely little co-working space called the Creativity Loft. And you and I have actually been there. You've come and visited that space with me. And it's this lovely space where mostly women, I think, are members there, but it's really open to anybody that can come in and rent time and have a monthly membership, or just rent a couple of hours, whatever you want to do, to work on creative projects. And it's owned by this incredible woman named Jackie, and it's a Black-owned business as well. And she actually created it as a response to some traumatic things that she went through in her life, and then has found that art has been really healing for her and therapeutic for her in her journey. And so she created the Creativity Loft, which is essentially a space for other people to come and gather. And they have I think they do a monthly or maybe every couple months, these maker markets where the tenants, basically the people who use that space, will sell their creations. So you can get, home goods and candles and art and jewelry, and a lot of it is handmade small batch type stuff. And so it's a great way to support the creator economy in North Seattle and Shoreline. I really love that space. I just love the vibe in there too. It's really pretty and just a really great place. So it's the creativityloft.com. And then for our non-local folks, I was trying to think about, some other ways that people, because we have listeners all over the country and actually all over the world, which is another surprising factor for us. But for those folks, so Sam actually spoiled my secret earlier. Well, it's not a secret if you know me, but I'm obsessed with killer whales. Absolutely obsessed with orcas.
Sometimes creepily obsessed. I
hey
digress.
now.
Just kidding.
What can I say? I grew up in the 90s.
I mean,
was
come on.
into Free Willy.
Free Keiko. Come on now.
Totally. I was one of those kids who was like writing letters, like, gotta get free Keiko. Anyway, so there's another orca. I know you're probably wondering where is this going? But I'll tell you, I promise. So there's an orca that is being held captive at the Miami Seaquarium in Florida, and she's actually a Washington-based orca. They call her Lolita, but her more common name, I guess, in the Pacific Northwest is Tokate. Mm-hmm. And she is considered part of the Lummi Nation, actually.
Oh, okay.
And so the Lummi Nation has this incredible campaign called Sacred Sea. So if you visit sacredsea.org, there's a bunch of information about it. And they have been trying for years. Now, this orca's been in captivity for like 50 years. It's incredible that she's still
50
alive.
50 years? Like 50?
Yes.
Holy smokes.
And if you know anything about orcas, they can live a really, really long time. Usually they don't last that long in captivity.
Wow.
But her like family pod is still here in the Puget Sound and is part of an endangered pod, the Southern Residents, for those of you who know anything about that. And so anyway, the Lummi Nation has been doing this incredible work, and it's led by the matriarchs of the Lummi Nation, who are activists, and they're trying to raise awareness and money and, you know, just do everything they can to get Tokate home, because there's a lot of ancestral roots and connections to that pod and to the orca population here in the Pacific Northwest. And so I am super passionate about this, if you can't already tell from my little rant here. But it would mean a whole lot to me, listeners, if you have any interest in endangered animals and just, you know, taking care of our earth, if you would go and donate and kind of support that effort to hopefully get Lolita Tokate home.
Love it.
So that's my other recommendation.
Well, this is, you know, our last couple minutes left of the Takeback podcast. I know it's bittersweet. It is sad. So we just want to take these next few moments just to kind of share our final thoughts and our call to action. I'm looking at you, Jess.
I taught you that concept.
Yes, you did. Yes, you did. But one of the things that's so important, the whole reason why we started this podcast, was to really highlight the work that needs to continue to be done regarding racial equity. Mm-hmm. So please, listeners, I implore you, please, please, please do not stop thinking about and working towards racial equity. Mm-hmm. I'm telling you right now, this is not a phase. This is not a fad. It's not a trend.
Which it often has felt like in the last couple of years. I feel like, sorry to interrupt, but there's been this shift that I've noticed. Mm-hmm. So in 2020, everybody was talking about it. White people, BIPOC, you know, everybody was invested in this concept of there are these injustices that need to be changed. And then what I've noticed, what you've noticed, and we've even seen it in the data of kind of our listener base.
It's fizzled out.
It's starting to fizzle. And we are the ones left, you know, BIPOC folks are the ones left still trying to have the conversation.
Right, because we just can't walk away. Right. This is our daily experience. So this is why, you know, I'm so glad that you brought this up, because this is the reason why it's like, you cannot stop. Mm-hmm. Please don't stop having these conversations and sharing these stories and supporting people of color, women of color creatives, because this is our lives. This is something that we deal with every single day. And so this is not a sprint. This is not something that we can fizzle out, right? This is not the tortoise and the hare. We don't want you guys to be the hare.
You're such a mom using that.
I know.
Example. I love it.
We want you to be the tortoise, okay? Slow and steady, slow and steady. This is a marathon. Mm-hmm. And it is so incredibly important that you continue to be intentional in the commitments to continue to embark change within these systems. Mm-hmm. So, listeners and allies, right? All of the above, right? Mm-hmm. The other thing that I'm going to encourage you guys to do is please keep supporting artists and creators of color.
Yes.
Please don't stop supporting them. Please throw your money at them.
Yes.
Give them a shout out. Give them a share. Give them a follow. Tell your family members about them. Tell your friends about them. Please, it's so important for you to do anything possible to continue to amplify their voices and their work and buying their products. This is a very easy and a practical way for you to support people that are doing amazing and cool work. And if you're someone who has some level of privilege and are a contributor in the creative economy, please build racial equity within your daily business practice. Please, please, please.
Be like Sam.
Please be like Sam. And if you don't know how to be like Sam, talk to Sam. I'm sure Sam, maybe if they reached out, he might have a conversation or two. I don't know. I'm looking at him and we'll tag
he gave us a thumbs up.
Okay, good.
So, yeah.
So yes, please, please, please. I would say support, support, support. Amplify, amplify.
Absolutely. And for our women of color creators, the reason that we started this podcast in the first place, if there's one thing we could say to you at the end of this podcast, it's to keep creating. Our show might be ending, but our story as creatives and as racial justice advocates is certainly not over, and neither is yours. You still have amazing art to put out, amazing stories to tell. And despite what the world has told you, or people with privilege or whatever might have told you, that you don't matter or your voice doesn't matter, that is not true. And you absolutely matter. You absolutely belong. And the world needs your voice.
Yes, we do.
Yeah. And, even though our podcast is ending, we're still going to be around. We'll be here cheering you on in our other kind of individual spaces and continuing to do this work alongside of you. And so we encourage you to keep in touch with us in our individual internet corners. In my case, you can find me at jesspilletmusic.com or Jess Pillet Music on all the socials. You can follow me on Instagram, which is where I'm kind of most active, but I'm also on Facebook and Twitter, and still not on TikTok. We'll see if that ever happens.
I'm holding my breath at this point. I've tried, but I'm holding my breath.
Well, don't hold your breath because it probably won't
I think
happen.
I'll pass out if I did, because it's not happening.
Exactly. And then where can people find you?
Yeah, honestly, it'll be easiest for people to continue to follow me on my Instagram page at Your Latina Therapist. There I have my link tree, which I keep up to date with ways you can find me. For folks that are in the Seattle area that are interested in therapy, I am listed on Therapy Den, so you can check that out as well, which is also linked in my bio on my Instagram account.
Awesome. And then here's some exciting news.
What?
For our moms.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Mom, are you ready? Are you ready for this one, Mom?
Mothers, our mothers, you're finally getting your wish, and we're moving all of these episodes to YouTube. Just gonna let that sink in. So if you're like, what the heck is happening right now? Our moms are technologically challenged.
That's a really kind way of saying it.
And they have pretty much been begging us since day one, or saying things like, I tried to search for it. Why can't I find it on YouTube?
Or why is it not on Facebook? Well, we're sort of on Facebook, Mom, but the
episodes
are not on Facebook.
They could not figure out how to find the full episode. So anyway, basically what we're going to do is we're going to archive all 14 of these episodes on YouTube, because we want these stories to live on. Even if we're not in active production anymore, we still want folks to be able to find this as a resource and something that might encourage them, and to go on that 14 episode journey with us wherever they are, whether it's tomorrow or years from now. It'll be there when you need it. And the link for that is going to be youtube.com/@ the Takeback Podcast. So just putting that out there. We'll have a link in the show notes as usual. I don't think we're going to get rid of our Instagram either. I don't know how active it'll be, but it'll still exist.
Right.
So if you want to come back and see photos and snippets of things that we've done this season, those will continue to live on the interwebs. You want to close this out, my dear?
Gosh, yes. Well, I'll say this. The timing of this all, we started 2022 with the announcement of starting this podcast.
Yeah.
And here we are at the end of 2022. And I am so incredibly proud. Oh my God, I'm going to start crying. I'm so proud of the work that we've done.
Me too.
And thank you, listeners, for being here, for supporting us, for cheering us on. Thank you once again to our guests. My goodness, I'm just so honored with the powerhouses that we've had here. And listeners, want to speak to you guys again. Thank you guys for journeying along with us and joining us from episode 1 to now episode 14. And with all that to be said, ending 2022, I want to say take this time to reflect on the joys, the highs and the lows, and taking a moment to think about all the intention that you want into this new year. And with that being said, have a happy, prosperous, and creative new year.
Yeah.
And we'll see you on the other side.
Yeah. Bye.